This has several things to it, and one of the things I've been trying to do is narrow it down to a really concise, although non-linear narrative. The crux of this whole series comes from my love of a book that was published in 1493 called the Nuremberg Chronicles. The Nuremberg Chronicles was the first printed history of the world. It was primarily history as told through biblical verse, but it also had a history of the monarchy throughout Europe, major battles and wars, and geography type of things. And in the pages, there's 2 pages that are a travelogue. And the travelogue is associated with Pliny the Elder. So 1493, which is Nuremberg Chronicles, Pliny the Elder lived in the 1st century AD. So he had been dead for 1400 years. But he did a lot, and he was kind of known as this, this historian, this scholar, a war hero. And he went on a series of adventures, specifically Northern Africa, into India, West Asia, were the places he primarily went. And he made this travelogue about all of the characters or monsters that he came across. And so on the travelogue, they took Pliny the Elder's dialogue from 1400 years prior, decided that they didn't need to fact check anything, just edited down what he said, had people that couldn't read, they gave them descriptions. They're like, okay, so this is a blamey. A blamey has a giant mouth on his stomach, eats people. Go for it. And then the person was like, okay, I'm going to draw a monster. And that's what they did. So there's 21 images of these monsters and the description of it. So several years ago I got interested. This is a really long story, I'm sorry. I got really interested in this idea of what Pliny actually saw. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Pliny at the time was in his late 50s, early 60s, which even if you have perfect eyesight, as you get older, your eyesight isn't as perfect. And if he doesn't have perfect eyesight, if you put your legs together, it looks like you have a single leg to me at this point in time, even from this distance. So it's really easy to be able to say that maybe he didn't have the greatest vision. And if he has something scary, he might not get that close to it, right? Secondly, a big part of it, and remember, this is specifically North Africa, India, and West Asia is the places he went. And if you start looking into tribal culture and other ideas of cultural beautification, you quickly come up with really obvious groups that he's referring to. So one of the most obvious visual examples is over near Burma. There is a tribe called the Powell Tribe. And he said in this area there was a race of bird people with really long necks that would stoop forward, and they had small beak mouths. And this area is home of the Powell Tribe. The Powell Tribe are the tribe that you might know that wear the neck rings that push down your shoulders to give the appearance of a longer neck. That's all cultural ideas of beautification or cultural misunderstanding or ideas of beauty being misunderstood. Other monsters have giant ears, and there's a lot of history of gauging or ear plates. People with massive lips and mouths for lip plates. People that have multiple heads over their body, which could easily be scarification or tattooing. Some of it runs into mythology that predates even Pliny, so he was not immune to the stories of what was supposed to be there before that. Blah, 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 blah. Some of this is directly referencing that and trying to get this idea of social and cultural misidentification and putting it into a new status. Another part of it is dealing with memory. So several years ago, I received 2 photo albums from my dad, from her mom. All the family had picked out photos of people that they knew, but there were still hundreds of photos of people that nobody remembered. And I found it really, really interesting that within 2 generations, this was within the invent of photography, usually between 1910 and about 1945, that there's this mass of people that have been completely forgotten. that maybe somebody knows, but nobody who interacted with them is either alive or the people that interacted with them's family no longer knows who they are. So I got really interested in memory as a form of afterlife, right? So if we think about heaven or whatever cultural heaven you might have, we sometimes think of this amorphous, cloudy space where everyone hangs out with everybody that you love. And what is that if not memory, right? Memory is this place where we remember things. And if it's pleasant memories, your pleasant memories go here. And if they're not, then they go to hell, right? Like that's the place where people who are bad are resigned to. And if they are forgotten, then they go into purgatory, right? They're just gone. So this kind of thought of recall and what memory actually means and what passing actually means and what we strive for as humans while we're alive, and the idea of recall versus reconfiguration is something that I got really interested in. When we remember things, we don't remember them as they are or were, we remember them as it's best told. So sometimes that is embellishing a story to make it a little sexier for your friends. Sometimes it's making it a little bit worse. Sometimes it's not even intentional that happens. But over the course of time, you remember things a little bit different. And if you remember them enough, then you remember the false version, and then you remember the false version. So when people die, when the last person who remembers you goes and away, then you fall into this category of, do you become myth? Do you become legend? Do you become religion? So we think of George Washington. We have no idea who George Washington is. What we have is a mythological concept of who that guy was, based off of a lot of misdirection and a lot of fairy tale and a small bit of truth. And that doesn't lessen him in any way, but that does not make him, he ceased to be a real person. He is now a mythological character. And what else is that if not heaven and hell and myth and gods and legends? So I'm just interested in telling this kind of non-linear story about memory. And so a lot of the plants, like rosemary, is the herb of memory. It's also a strong feminine power thing. I have a strong push towards gender and the fluidity of love and who we are and what makes us and how we're not always like masculine and feminine are just relative depending on who you're with and when you're with them and who you are. And to that line of the story, something that hasn't happened yet, but this is kind of the first iteration of seeing it like this, is I have, and kind of going back to that comic book idea, I have word bubbles and vignettes that are going to have a storyline in them. It will not be a absolutely linear, this happens and this happens and this happens, but the idea is that in a perfect world, this would be in a space that has one door, and when you walked in, you started with the first figure, and you as the viewer were an integral part to the procession, and you would read, and then as you exited, you would also be the last character to leave. And this would be talking about that idea of memory, more than the Pliny stuff, although that plays into it too, because what happened with the Nuremberg Chronicles is basically a game of telephone, right? Somebody said that somebody said that somebody said that something was said, which is what memory and talk is. You said, that he said, that she said, and over the course of the time there's truths there, but they might not be an absolute truth. But that doesn't make it untrue. It just means it's fluid. So that was incredibly long-winded, and I apologize, but sort of. This is the short answer. There's sort of a story.